A Course in
What?
with Cynthia Morgan.
Hey, course friends. Welcome to A Course in What? I'm Cynthia Morgan, and this is a podcast in which I read and discuss the text of A Course in Miracles. And A Course in What is a free weekly podcast that comes out every Tuesday. And I want to thank you for joining me on this episode number 44. And I want to say thank you so much. There's a couple new reviews on iTunes of this podcast, some great reviews. So I really appreciate that. Thank you for taking the time. That means so much to me. And it always warms my heart and makes me smile when I see those. And hopefully it inspires other people to listen to the podcast, to get involved in doing their own studying of A Course in Miracles and doing the workbook lessons. And it also, truthfully, inspires me to keep going, knowing that you like the podcast, that you're following along with me, because it's just me sitting here talking. And so when I see a review and people saying that it means something to them, it means something to me too, to read that. So thank you to a couple of you listeners out there who lately have been taking the time to get on your computer and find the iTunes and find the review and figure out what you're going to say and write it down. It just means a lot. So thank you. If you're on Facebook, you may have noticed that we have a podcast Facebook page at facebook.com/A Course in What. And a listener wrote a question for me on the Facebook page this week, and it's about lesson number 5. I am never upset for the reason I think. And he asked for some clarification in how to go about doing that lesson. And he said that he's probably just overthinking it all so that he can get it right. He acknowledged that his ego is probably just tripping him up. So I hope that I answered his question, and it got me thinking about how much we as students of A Course in Miracles overthink this course. And A Course in Miracles says that it's a simple course. And obviously, any of us who are studying it don't think that it's that simple, but it really is simple. It's not easy. It takes a lot of focus and dedication and effort, obviously, to read through the text, to think about what it's saying, to do the lessons each day. But that effort and discipline and dedication and focus is really something different than it being simple. Simple doesn't necessarily mean easy. And to me, when the Course says it's a simple course, it means that it's built on a simple idea. And that is that only love is real. So most students, if they're really studying the course, at some point you will get caught up in the terminology and the metaphysics. And we love all those aspects to the course. It's partly what draws us to this being our particular spiritual path. But we also have to keep in mind that our ego loves specifics. And all of those things, the metaphysics, the terminology, etc., those are specifics. The Holy Spirit, on the other hand, speaks in generalities. The ego loves specificity. And I find that true in my work as a hypnotherapist as well, that when clients are in hypnosis and we're accessing their higher selves, the language and the message of their higher self is always simple, and it's always general. For instance, their higher selves may say things like believe, have faith, let go, trust, be patient, forgive. There's a whole list of them in my book from actual sessions, things that people have said from their higher selves. And I would say their higher self is the part of their mind connected to the Holy Spirit. That's what I'm talking about when I say their higher self. That love in their mind that they're accessing in a hypnosis session is then translated into a message that that person needs to hear. But I've never heard someone's higher self say things like, after this session, go to the grocery store and buy 2 stalks of celery, 1 head of lettuce, and 2 carrots, and then eat that for lunch. Or go to an acupuncturist, or break up with Jane, or whatever. Those are all specifics. And it's not to say that that can't ever happen, that the Holy Spirit or their higher self speaks in specifics. It's just really rare. And in fact, it happened to Helen. But again, that's very rare that the Holy Spirit or God speaks to people in those specific ways. It's as rare as you and I scribing A Course in Miracles. That's how rare it is. Not to say it can't happen, because it happened to Helen, and I'm sure it's happened to other people, but generally speaking, our higher self speaks in generalities. And Kenneth Wapnick used to tell a story about Helen Schucman and her search for green pantyhose. And it's a pretty famous story that Kenneth Wapnick talks about. So indulge me if you've already heard it. But Helen was known to be a really good shopper. She liked to shop and she was good at it. And one day she got this idea that she had to have a pair of green pantyhose. And so she asked Jesus, since, of course, she was on a word-to-word basis with Jesus, she said, I want to know where to find the cheapest, best pantyhose, green pantyhose that I can get. Tell me where to find them. And Jesus directed her to go to S. Klein's, some store, I suppose, on the square in New York City. So she went to that specific store, and sure enough, there was the green pantyhose that she had been looking for. But then Jesus said to Helen, I have an ocean of love to give to you. But every time you ask me for something like green pantyhose, you're coming to that ocean with a teaspoon. Don't just ask for a teaspoon. Take the whole ocean. He said, it's okay to ask for concrete things, but just know that there's so much more to ask for. Don't get stuck with the trivia, with the things that ultimately don't matter. And I've always really loved that story. So obviously, there are specifics in A Course in Miracles, like the difference between the words ego and Holy Spirit, or perception and knowledge, and the idea of judgment, as we've been discussing in the section that we're on, and what the Course means by the authority problem. And obviously, it's important for us as students of the Course to understand those terms and to familiarize ourselves with that language and apply those words to our study and apply them to our lives. But if you're banging your head against the wall, you're probably caught up in the ego trap of specifics. And you simply need to just back up to generalities. In other words, you are probably overthinking it. You're getting stuck on the green pantyhose. And you may recall what Helen said when she finished scribing A Course in Miracles. She said, finally, a spiritual path for the intellectual. And I do find, as I've said before, that A Course in Miracles attracts intellectual types, the type of people who process things through their intellect, as opposed to their feeling self. They're thinkers. But I like to think that serious students of the Course are also very pragmatic and practical people as well. But we've all met some students of A Course in Miracles who are the exact opposite of that, haven't we? So there are exceptions, of course. And almost always, when I sit down before the podcast and read through what I'll be reading and discussing for that particular episode, I get tripped up on the first sentence. I mean, it happens almost every single time. And most of the time it's because we've stopped midsection. So I don't remember what we were reading before. It's like we were on a roll and then we just stopped and I picked it up a week later. And I just sit there and I usually just stare at the first sentence for a few minutes going, I have no idea what that means. And sometimes it's not overthinking it at all. Sometimes it's just drawing a complete blank. It's no thinking. It's zero. There's nothing in my head. There's nothing to start on. And then I reread it a few times, and maybe I read the paragraph before it, and then I start to find the rhythm again. But I find that if I'm overthinking, which happens at least once, not just in the first sentence when I begin, but usually another time, I step back and move away from the specifics. And I just tell myself, quit thinking so hard. And I step back to the general theme of A Course in Miracles. I just reconnect back to the love in my mind, where there's no separation, where only love is real. Those general themes of the Course. And if I keep that idea in my mind, and I just take a moment and step away and come right back, then it makes perfect sense to me. So for me, it's kind of like walking a tightrope with one foot on the rope of the metaphysics of the ideas and the specifics, and another foot kind of out there in the generalities of the main themes of no separation, forgiveness, only love is real. And so I want to just acknowledge that confusion with A Course in Miracles is so normal. And it makes sense because we're using the ego's specifics, a specific language, specific ideas to get us out of specifics. And how can that not be confusing to the ego? But it all does work out in the end. You just keep moving forward, one foot in front of the other. If you step away and it still doesn't make sense, mark the sentence that doesn't make sense. I've done that. Or I write a question I have in the back of the book. And sometimes I forget about that question for years. And I come back to that sentence I've underlined or the question I wrote in the back weeks, months, years later. And I'm like, that's silly. Of course I know the answer to that. Why did I write that down? You'll answer your own question in time. So having said all of that, let's read a little bit of the specific message from A Course in Miracles. And we are on chapter 3, The Innocent Perception, section 6, Judgment and the Authority Problem. We left off with paragraph 7. So let's begin there, sentence 1. I have spoken of different symptoms, and at that level, there is almost endless variation. So these symptoms are the effects of the belief in separation. The symptom of body aches and chills and fever aren't the problem. It's the virus in the system. So separation, in a sense, is the virus in our system. It's the virus in our mind. The effects are everything that is loveless. Those are the symptoms. There are myriad symptoms, but only one cause. 2, there is, however, only one cause for all of them, the authority problem. So we think the problem is the symptom, the effect. I mean, how many advertisements do we see for cold medicines or whatever for the flu that takes away body aches and takes away chills? But none of them says it cures the virus. We are trying to change the symptom, the effect, but the problem is the guilt in our mind. That's that virus, which causes us to think lovelessly. And that loveless thinking is then projected out. And we think that's the problem, the projections of the mind. But the mind is the problem. And specifically, the decision to choose the ego over the Holy Spirit is the problem. To not choose love is our problem. And why don't we choose love? Because we have an authority problem, as it says. The great authority on love is obviously God. And he's asking us to choose love. But we're like rebellious teenagers who think we know best. No one can tell a rebellious teenager what to do. They're not going to choose love in that moment. And therein lies our authority problem. So here he's saying there's only one cause for all of those symptoms, the authority problem. He hasn't explained the authority problem yet, but he tells us that it is the cause. 3, this is, quote, the root of all evil. And the root of all evil is choosing the ego. It's thinking that we authored ourselves, that all that exists is I. And this isn't solipsism. I mean it in terms of that I'm all that matters. That I, my individual self that I think of as I, is all that matters, is all that exists. I created myself. And you may recognize this quote from the Bible that says, "For the love of money is the root of all evil." So here he's correcting that, so to speak. 4, every symptom the ego makes involves a contradiction in terms because the mind is split between the ego and the Holy Spirit, so that whatever the ego makes is incomplete and contradictory. So because the mind is split, everything the ego makes is a part of this split mind. It's not whole with a W. So the effects rest on an untenable position. It's always incomplete and contradictory. 5, this untenable position is the result of the authority problem, which, because it accepts the one inconceivable thought as its premise, can produce only ideas that are inconceivable. So the one inconceivable thought is that separation is possible. All effects are temporary. Everything in this world dies. Everything that you see with your physical eyes isn't going to be here. It's going to die. You can know the source by its effects. The effects are unstable in this world, so the source must be unstable. Paragraph 8, sentence 1. The issue of authority is really a question of authorship. So who do you believe authored you? That's the question. Who are you listening to as your teacher? 2, when you have an authority problem, it is always because you believe you are the author of yourself and project your delusion onto others. So I read this as you think you know what's right. And that's what teenagers who are the authority on authority problems think. They think they're right. They think that the problem is their parents or the principal at school or society. But they're their own problem. They don't have the wisdom to understand that they're wrong. And of course, I'm speaking generally. I'm speaking about rebellious teenagers. You know the ones. Sometimes the smartest people in the rooms are teenagers, but generally speaking, that rebellious teenager, to him or her, everyone else is the problem. 3, you then perceive the situation as one in which others are literally fighting you for your authorship. And that too reminds me of rebellious teenagers. They're literally fighting everyone all the time. And they're just fighting to understand themselves. They're fighting for their own authorship. And as students of the course, if we believe we are separate, then we obviously believe everyone outside of ourselves is separate too. And from that premise, it has to be every man for himself. I'm searching for my own power. Because the ego tells us that scarcity principle, that there isn't enough to go around. I need to look out for me. I need to be the smartest one or whatever. Everyone else is fighting us for that authorship. And I think that just means they're fighting for power and control. 4, this is the fundamental error of all those who believe they have usurped the power of God. If you have that fundamental error and believe you have usurped God, which is what the ego tells us, you will believe that that power lies in separation, that there's something to be found in separation that's necessary. And let me also add, I don't think there's anything wrong with being a rebellious teenager. I'm just using that as an example that we are all like that. I think that Carl Jung was right. He said you spend the first half of your life developing an ego and the second half trying to get rid of it. So I think even in the rebellious teenage phase, they're searching for that identity. They're developing their ego. They're asserting who they are and what they know and figuring it all out. It can often be an important time. But since most likely you're not a teenager and listening to this, you've outgrown that phase, we can all identify with that now and recognize that we didn't have the wisdom that we thought we did. 5, this belief is very frightening to them, but hardly troubles God. So what belief is that? The belief that we've usurped God, that fundamental error of separation. And that manifests in different symptoms, that we're alone and we have to fend for ourselves, or if we believe that death is real, or any number of ideas that might be scary to us, growing old, whatever it is, all those beliefs are troubling to us, to one who believes in separation, but hardly to God. He knows they're all part of a silly dream. They're all under the umbrella of one problem, the authority problem. But he isn't concerned with that authority problem. He doesn't bat an eye at separation. It's like a guru in the presence of that rebellious teenager. They're not going to bat an eye. They're just going to accept it and understand it. And of course, I'm speaking metaphorically. God doesn't have physical eyes to bat. 6, he is, however, eager to undo it, not to punish his children, but only because he knows that it makes them unhappy. So he's eager to wake us up from the dream, to undo the dream of separation, because it's really a nightmare. Compared to his reality, compared to our truth, this world is a nightmare. And he's saying this act of being asleep makes us unhappy. And we might think that we're happy because we got something, or somebody did something for us, or we did something for somebody else, and that's all fine. And that may be part of our process, but it's not our true reality. It's not our true happiness. True happiness isn't world dependent. 7, God's creations are given their true authorship, but you prefer to be anonymous when you choose to separate yourself from your author. And we're given another way of living, but we turn our backs and choose the ego. We don't listen to that true author with a capital A, God. We prefer to be anonymous. And anonymous people, they're not connected to anything, not even a name. There's no identity. They're just anonymous. They're separate from. 8, being uncertain of your true authorship, you believe that your creation was anonymous. So being uncertain of our true authorship is where we're at now, especially any of us reading the course. We're not teenagers anymore, but we're not the guru. We're not fully invested in separation and our ego, but we're not 100% convinced yet that giving all of that up will get us anything of value. So we're kind of in that limbo phase. 9. This leaves you in a position where it sounds meaningful to believe that you created yourself. Yeah, it just sounds more meaningful to believe that what we see is real, that what we feel is real, that giving birth creates life. In our uncertainty, in that limbo stage, it's easier to remain our own author. It's easier to buy into the ego. 10. The dispute over authorship has left such uncertainty in your mind that it may even doubt whether you really exist at all. Notice he says it may even doubt. He's not saying it will, that this will result in doubt. He's saying it may. Maybe you've questioned whether you actually exist. I think most of us have at one time or another, haven't we? In our existential crisis, in the middle of the night or whenever that is, and you question, who am I? Where did I come from? Who created me? And ultimately, all that questioning has to come from our authority problem in our mind. I mean, there's a part of all of us that knows the truth, that this isn't our true authorship, that this isn't our reality with a capital R. And there's always in the back of our mind this beckoning of the Holy Spirit to awaken and to come home. The Course says we feel like aliens here. So I think part of that questioning is knowing that there is this conflict within us of our true home and then where, of course, we believe that we are in this world. But ultimately, all that question has to come from an authority problem. It comes from separation. We don't know our source. Therefore, we don't know who we truly are. And when we know our source, we will know ourselves. Okay, we'll stop there for today. And if you would like to stay in touch, as I mentioned, we have a podcast page on Facebook, and that's at facebook.com/A Course in What. And you can also connect with me on my Facebook hypnotherapy page, which is facebook.com/Cynthia Morgan Hypnotherapy. And you can go to my website, cynthiamorgan.us. All right. And if you would like to say the summary of A Course in Miracles with me, that would be great. Nothing real can be threatened. Nothing unreal exists. Herein lies the peace of God.